So for the next 20 minutes, you are going to be professors of psychology judging the work I'm about to present to you, because it took 7 years to do the PhD, and many people in the room helped me, encouraged me, and so on. And at the end of it, I was told there's a panel, and you have got 15 minutes to present 7 years' work. Yeah? It better be good, and then we'll spend a few hours slicing and dicing it. Yeah? So what I thought I'd do today is give you that 15-minute presentation, but because you're so special, I've extended it to 20 and added in a little bit of post-PhD research that I shared at a conference as well. So are you up for going into that mode of this is... Yay! After Rainer's followed on from that with his research, which is going to be the history of psychometrics and competencies over the last 20, 25 years, and I'll touch on some of Rainer's work in mine. We'll then take questions, and we'll see where we get to. So, exploring the impacts on criterion validity of reducing evaluative bias, measuring the big five. Here we go. So, in terms of the structure, there's some achievements in the PhD. Why is it of interest? 5 aims, 9 different research questions, some highlights, some key findings, limitations, some suggestions, and a few conclusions, all delivered in the next 20 minutes. So, to cut to the chase, and I should say the PhD focused on a research version of Spark, so it was somewhat detached from the core commercial offering, but you'll get the gist. So, the 3 main achievements: 1, looking at reducing evaluative bias. Can we look at a way of reducing it? I'll spoil it for you and tell you the answer is yes. This can also help us value diversity by valuing all the different ways of being. Can we measure personality adaptively and maladaptively? That's academic speak, maladaptively for what we would call overextended, but in the literature it's adaptive and maladaptive, without the need to pathologize. Can we see if there's some new blended traits that have not been measured before? And the answer is we can. And can we improve our scientific understanding of performance at work? There's something called the bandwidth fidelity debate. Some people think it's best to measure the big 5 just at the high level. Some like lots of detail into lots of qualities and personas. Can we enlighten that debate? We can, and fidelity is better, just to go to the punchline. Just measuring at the high level is not supported so much by this research. So why is this interesting? Well, it's a contribution to science. There is a bias in many personality instruments towards one end of a spectrum over the other. We do need to measure dysfunctional stuff at work, but we don't want to go into mental health models. That's not helpful. It's not humanistic. We do want greater fidelity and greater detail, and we want to help organisational psychology improve interpersonal relationships, have better leaders. And this research is pretty timely because cultures are changing. As we heard from millennials earlier today, they don't want to be labelled. They want to be more inclusive. And what we call deep diversity. So there's gender, there's ethnicity, but deep diversity is our way of being. We want to value that, and one way of valuing it is to measure it without bias. So that's why the research is interesting. This is Jupiter, as it was photographed, 20 years ago with the best science we had. But now we can get a bit closer to it with higher quality cameras, and we know it's something more like this. There's a dynamic there, it's moving, and there's a parallel here with personality, because it used to be, 30, 40 years ago, people said your personality, it's like fixed, it's static. Maybe you just need 5 high-level things. We're done. But it turns out it's not as simple as that. We have different personas. We change as we age. We change on different days. And as we heard Dawn's PhD on social intelligence, we can, in fact, read a situation, tune up, tune down. There's a dynamic. And essentially, Spark is a dynamic way of looking at personality. We've done the first 2 bullets. We're 3 or 4 minutes in. We're now on to the 5 aims, the 9 research questions. So Thank you, thank you. Sticking to time. No. So the 5 aims, can we measure both polarities of each big 5 dimension as scalar opposites? Can we explore evaluative bias? And Backstrom is a researcher in the Nordic region that spent a couple of decades looking at evaluative bias. And the answer is we can. Can we measure adaptive and maladaptive scales, and can we do that within one instrument? Is it helpful to look at doing too much of a good thing with the big 5, or do we need a completely different model? It turns out we can look at overextending, and the research compared the Spark approach with the Hogan dark side approach, did lots of correlations there. Is it useful? Like, does it correlate with things in the real world, such as performance at work? And how does it link to 2 researchers called Woods and Anderson, who've created a periodic table of personality traits? This is sort of the latest thinking in psychometrics. So Spark has been placed in this periodic table, which is a good way of looking at validity. Is there good criterion validity? Does everything we measure actually correlate with something that goes on at work? We measured this with 360 feedback on people's performance, and yes, it does. And the 5th aim was to explore this bandwidth fidelity debate. Is it better to stick at the high level? Does it merit going down to a lower level? Those are the aims in the PhD. So, if you stick your head in the oven and your feet in the freezer, on average, you'll be comfortable. That's sort of what some of us have experienced. I done a few big 5 instruments. If I do the NEO, I come out as 55% agreeable. You're sort of in the middle. No. Thank you. Thank you for the feedback. So it turns out I'm not really in the middle. I'm very, very strongly people-focused. I like to have empathy. I like to collaborate. I like to be a nice guy, and I don't want you to fall out. At the same time, I can be outcome-focused. Although I'm not particularly tough, I'm pretty logical. I will argue with you if I need to argue. I can be competitive. So I'm actually strongly both. So the average is not so useful. That's a premise that sort of underpins this research. So in terms of the PhD, there were 5 aims. You've seen those. There were 9 research questions I'll share later. And there were 42 hypotheses that were tested. So things that were saying, I wonder if this could be true. I'm going to test it with some data. So what are the highlights? Well, here is evaluative bias in action, a little bit of humor. An extrovert's energized by interacting with others, and an introvert runs away from extroverts. It's funny, but actually there's a bias in there in favor of extroversion. A lot of humor has bias in it, reinforcing our own perspectives. So there's cultural biases around the big 5, but there's also measurement biases. So if we have a look here, why do we have this bias in psychometrics? Why is one end measured more positively than another? There's in fact lots of reasons, but one of them is as straightforward as factor analysis and statistics. So this is a quote from Peterson and some other academics. When an evaluatively unbalanced set of descriptors, like the big 5 adjectives from Goldberg, is put through a rotation algorithm, that's factor analysis, the resulting factors end up contrasting positive versus negative. What does that mean? Well, here's a practical example. Here are some words that measure extroversion. Bold, daring, vigorous, assertive, talkative. Do they sound good? Do you think people would want them if you asked them are they good? What about these words? These are the introverted words. Inhibited, timid, reserved, shy, quiet. Now, bear in mind, this is a couple of decades of research from Goldberg that created these adjectives. This has come out of decades of statistical analysis. Take all the adjectives, find the best 1,000, best 500, down to the best 100. These are the best 10 statistically for extroversion, the best 10 statistically for introversion. Can anyone see a bias in them? It's sort of obvious. It's so obvious, you almost don't need to quantify it, although I did quantify it just for good measure. So a quick survey that some of you may have helped me with a couple of years ago said, how desirable are each of those statements? And this is the quantification. So we've got the big 5 across here, and the sort of positive end of the spectrum, openness, conscientious, is at the top, and the less favorable end is at the bottom on a scale of 1 to 5. So if we look at extroversion, Extroversion sort of scored 3.7 in terms of attractiveness, introversion 2.4, and this is a measure of the evaluative bias. That's how these adjectives are biased. That makes sense? So you can sort of put a number on it. And it's not really a new issue. When I started the PhD, I said I wanted to do this, and they said, why are you doing it? And I said, well, I've experienced on workshops and as a practitioner that this seems to be an issue, and it was like I'd just told these academics that I like, murdering people at the weekend. You're not supposed to do that. No. Where's it referenced? Who's written about it before? Fortunately, Peabody had done in 1967, so there is a body of research to reference around this, but it's not really been acted on or taken too much notice of. But it does impact user validity, how you experience a questionnaire, and also construct validity. If you're measuring extroversion positively and introversion not so, are you really measuring the full construct? I would argue not. Have we measured things in an unbiased way? And how do people feel about getting a report back that might not be fully valuing everything? So here's the model that we all know. There's the Big Five. Here's it using Big Five terminology, adaptive, maladaptive, and so on. You get all this. I make new friends easily, extroversion, and typically introversion is measured by I listen too much, I don't give my view. I would suggest that's adaptive. This is maladaptive, or as we would call it, overextended. If you want to balance it, you need 4 questions in the questionnaire. I choose my words carefully before I speak is a positive way of valuing introversion, and sometimes I talk too much is overplaying my extroversion. Now we're starting to net out the biases and reduce the evaluative bias. That's the gist of it. So it's almost like four points of a compass, and if we want to reduce evaluative bias, one approach is to net them out in this way. There are other approaches that Baxton's highlighted. This is the one that we prefer. So having done this in the tome of a PhD, has anyone read it? Anyone seen it? You can download it. Thank you, Nikita. You'll find lots of stuff on test, retest, Cronbach alpha, construct validity, consensual validity, and so on. There's a lot. About half of it is quantitative analysis, if you wish, but that's not included in this. This is the IPIP Neo, so that really one of the gold standards for academic research, and it's just showing that in this academic gold standard, there is also evaluative bias. Not quite as much as the adjectives, but still, if you look at conscientiousness, in the Neo, the ones that describe being organized and focused and planned, those are desirable, and being a bit disorganized and chaotic, turns out people don't really seem to want that. Yeah? So there could be a better way of framing it. If we go to the Spark data, we've reduced the evaluative bias. We've not completely minimized it. There could be some more work for Julie and myself to do, but you get the gist with Spark, that this bottom row here, these numbers are significantly reduced. We didn't include the 5th factor, neuroticism, in my PhD. At the time, the advice was it's too difficult, don't go there with that one. But since doing that research, of course, we've created Lumina Emotion, and we know we can actually balance it with the 5th factor too, reward reactors, risk reactors. So if we were to redo this, we'd get the final column going as well. Yeah? So have we reduced evaluative bias? Well, there were a number of hypotheses to test, and they were all supported. The gist of it is we've got less evaluative bias in Spark than in these other instruments, such as the trait descriptive adjectives and the Neo, all supported. And this took me 6 months to learn how to do confirmatory factor analysis. It took me another 6 months to do it. And there you go. There's 2 slides on it. And what it's telling you is these are all the qualities in the Big Five at both ends, adaptive, maladaptive. And if you do a hypothesis test that says the Big Five exists, the 5 independent factors, and that's it, that's rejected, because it turns out they're not 5 independent factors. They're all quite linked. How are they linked? Well, it took a while to figure it out. The gist of it is that's quite complicated. And if you put it into a table with coefficients, beta coefficients, it's a complex picture. A quick summary of it, some interesting correlations. You might be interested to know that if you tend to be high on openness or big picture thinking, that starts to correlate with low conscientiousness or inspiration-driven, as we call it, and so on. So there's some quite strong correlations, which is why we lay it out in a circle. If there was nothing going on here, we probably wouldn't have a circle. We'd just have 5 columns. Yep. This is linking the research to the Woods and Anderson periodic table. So what Woods and Anderson do is they take 2 bits of the big 5. This is agreeableness and openness. And they sort of look at blends. What happens if you blend agreeableness with openness? And then this is a periodic table, obviously drawing on the idea from chemistry of trying to sort of define it all accurately and look at blends. This is quite an innovative and new approach. So with the Spark model, we had a look and said, well, where would it fit in this periodic table? Which is a way of trying to understand what have we got here, what are we measuring? And the research did find that sort of overextended around conscientiousness is something in the Woods and Anderson table that's not been measured before, at least not by the main big psychometrics such as Hogan, Neo, and others. So there's some things in Spark that are being measured that are not so commonly measured elsewhere. Then we got on to the Great 8. Now, Rainer will follow me. Rainer is actually the author of the Great 8 model, or a co-author of the Great 8 model. And I was delighted to collaborate with him. I stalked him for a few years, watching him talk at conferences, and then approached him to help. And so the Great 8 was developed by Rainer and Professor Bartram back in 2002 and 2003, and a bit more in 2005, and so on. So I'll let Rainer speak to it more. And this is sort of the Great 8 in action. It's the interface between your personality and your competence at work. So the bit that we're familiar with is the big 5 level, openness, conscientiousness, and so on. You can go up. Julie shared a couple of days ago alpha and beta, the 2 higher order factors that link to sort of the neuroscience. You can go right up to the top. Has anyone heard of the general factor of personality? So there's thank you, Nikita. There is a theory, which is, I think it's statistically valid, that you can boil personality down to 1 number. Yeah, so Janice, you're 33, Kevin, you're 42, and so on. And it's the 1 factor of personality, and people get quite excited about it statistically. I can't quite figure out how useful it would be in reality. Strikes me as not so helpful, but it's there statistically, so it's at the top. Yeah. It has been described as a scale which measures whether you're alive or dead. So if you come out really low on it, you're just not there. And then down the bottom is the Great 8 that Rainer and Professor Bartram and so on research. And this is where we go from personality into how we perform at work, our behaviors at work. And you can see how openness splits into creativity and analysis and so on. These are the questions that Rainer created, and we evolved slightly for the PhD research. Many of you filled these in because I sent them out to you and said, can you get feedback from your friends and staff? And this is what you were asking them to assess you on. And here's the results. Down here, we've got the familiar Spark scales. I've just summarized it into the adaptive and the overextended. And over here, we've got the Great 8 with all the correlations. So quick simplification, take off the lower ones that are not significant. There were 14 hypotheses to test, and where it's shaded red, I'd hypothesized it should link. I'd hypothesized that your personality would correlate with what other people at work said about your performance using the Great 8. And the red ones, it didn't work out. Hypothesis not supported. So I thought analyzing situations would correlate with being a big picture thinker. It didn't. But it turned out that outcome focus did. And I thought that controlling resources, according to the literature, should correlate with extroversion. It didn't. But being a reward reactor and not a risk reactor seemed to make you better at that. But then a number were supported. So if we create concepts, if our staff think we're good at strategizing, that does link with our big picture thinking. Relating to people does indeed correlate with extroversion. And we can see respecting people does indeed correlate with being people-focused. Adapting to demands links well to being a reward reactor. Delivering results, a bit of a blend, but includes some discipline there. Driving performance, sort of similar type picture, and so on. You get the idea? So a second piece of research, now this is post-PhD, so this is looking at sort of repeating this analysis, but this time going down to the quality level and repeating a study undertaken by Reiner and Professor Bartram and Saville and others over the last 15 years, which looks a bit like this. Taking it down to the quality level, finding the high ones, choosing a top one, and choosing 2 other qualities that are secondary ones, and creating a predictive model. So the model for analysing situations says 2 lots of conceptual, 1 lot of observing, and 1 lot of logic will make you good at analysing situations. And that's the methodology proposed by Professor Bartram and so on. So if we take that methodology and turn it into a correlation matrix, so here we've taken the measures of the big 5 at that lower level, turned them into a prediction, correlated it with what staff and peers and your boss think. We have a look at the diagonal, and the gist of it is this is pretty good evidence that our Spark model at the quality level is pretty good at saying whether you'll be good at different competencies at work. That's the gist of it in the eyes of staff and peers. So this diagonal here, because these numbers are quite respectable, and the average is 0.29, that sort of suggests we're doing pretty well. In fact, I think we're doing very well. So this is comparable with some of the other big models on the market, SHL, Wave, and so on. So there were 9 research questions that were explored here, and I'll quickly answer them. Is the Spark model compatible with the big 5? Now we measure both ends and overextend. Yes, it is the quick answer. You can read more detail, but that's the summary. Where do things sit in the periodic table? Pretty much where we expected them to. No great surprises. And a few blends have come out. Do the adaptive scales, that's underlying and everyday, do they correlate more than the overextended with bright side traits in other big 5 models, such as Hogan and the NEO? And they do. So we would expect underlying and everyday to correlate more with other people's measures that are intended to be positive. And do the overextended, the maladaptive with Spark, does that correlate more with Hogan's dark side? Because Hogan's dark side sets out to measure some of these dysfunctional behaviors. And the answer is yes and no. It does for some, with introversion and so on, but not with others. So there's a bit more research needed there. Little bit of confusion. Overall, I think I conclude that overextending is a nicer way of looking at it rather than jumping to a mental health model using DSM-4. Can we support Spark having maladaptive being overplayed? I think there's evidence here we can. The hypotheses on criterion validity, we got 12 out of 14, which was pretty good, the results I've shared with you. Have we got differential patterns? We have, meaning that breaking things down, underlying everyday overextended, measuring both ends, we are measuring different things there. It's not worth collapsing it into one number and saying keep it simple. That would be the sort of going down the bandwidth thing, just keep it simple, high level. No, going down to more detail does produce differential correlations, and there's lots of statistical tests in the PhD to support that. Again, similar point about the 5 dimensions versus the detail. And can we reduce evaluative bias? Well, the answer is yes, we can. That's been demonstrated. But even more than just the numbers, what's really important is you can explore it. You can talk about it. I can look at my people-focused underlying, my outcome-focused underlying, everyday overextended. I can look at it as a dynamic, and I can make sense of it and create meaning. So it's not just the numbers, it's also exploring what that means for me. So, were there some limitations in this research? There were. It's a weird sample, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. This research needs to be repeated in numerous countries before we can start to truly generalize it. Everything in terms of performance was measured in terms of 360. I think that's a good way to do it, but there are other ways of doing it. It doesn't have to be. So it could be repeated with other measures of performance. Can we assume, because personality correlates with how you perform at work, that one drives the other? We can't. That needs more work. We could replicate this on new samples. That would be a good thing to do. Julie and myself are working on that. Could it be that maladaptive traits overextended impact your performance negatively, but sometimes support your performance? I think we know the answer is yes, and we're gathering some research on that. Sometimes your overextended is there to rescue you. Can neuroticism be expressed adaptively? Now, remember, this was the PhD before we went on and created Lumina Emotion and so on. So this was a research question. The answer is it can. That's why we've got reward reactors, risk reactors, both expressed in an underlying and everyday form. But that was the research, a follow-on piece of research really from this. And can emotional stability be expressed maladaptively? Is it possible my great confidence, my calmness, my optimism, could it ever be overplayed? What do you reckon, Marie? No, I don't think so either. But yeah, of course we can overextend emotional stability, or as we call it, the reward reactor. So there were some suggestions here. Can we do a maladaptive or an overextended periodic table, like Woods and Anderson have done? That's a nice idea. Can we use Spark to really understand other instruments? Because we've measured some things in a different way by measuring both ends and the three personas. Yes, I think we can. And a few conclusions. Well, evaluative bias, it is an issue. It's definitely an issue. We've heard numerous talks over the last few days about people saying they didn't feel truly valued with some other instruments, and then with Spark, somehow it spoke to their core more. Can we address this by measuring both ends? We can. Can maladaptive or overextended, is that a good thing? We think it is. Can we reduce evaluative bias? Well, we certainly can compared to some other instruments. And can we explore the periodic table and see where it fits? So we really know what's in Spark and how it links to other instruments. Well, yes, we can. So was that 15 minutes? Maybe it took 20-ish. So that was basically the gist of the talk that I delivered, and then for the PhD, and then went into great detail on some of the statistics behind it and so on. I'm going to ask you to hold your questions because I want to make the space for Rainer to share his talk, and then we'll both take questions together. Make sense? So, and just to set the context, Rainer created the Great 8 model and has worked in this area for a good co-creator, worked in this area for a good 30 years, and there isn't much he doesn't know about how all this works. So Rainer, join the stage. You want a clicker?
Okay, so thanks for your kind words, Mary and Stewart. And I'm delighted to talk to you, a captive audience, on my favorite topic, predicting performance through competencies. So I've been at that for 25 or 30 years, and I'll share with you some of the highlights of that research, roughly aligned to my first kind of 12 years in the profession at SHL, then almost 10 years at Saville Consulting, now Saville Assessment. And for the last 4 years, I've been at Cubics. And I will finish off on a bit of research into the dark side. So where did it start for me? Got thrown in at the deep end. I was asked to do the data analysis for the Robertson and Kinder meta-analysis, which was quite influential. Predictor tool, always the OPQ with 30 scales, and also verbal numerical reasoning tests. On the criterion side, lots of different studies with lots of different criteria. So what Robertson and Kinder had to do, they had to develop a criterion taxonomy to group things together. And you can see the 13 criterion areas here. And what they then did, they asked experts to make judgments which OPQ personality scales should predict those criterion areas. And I'm particularly pleased with this table because I initiated it and got it into the article. And if we perhaps look at managing staff, you can see that a scale called controlling is quite a good predictor of managing staff. Also, being persuasive and socially confident is quite helpful. Being behavioral didn't really help. And what Robertson and Kinder found is that if we just simply average those correlations, then you get quite low values. If we first add up the scores for each individual, then we get a kind of composite predictor scale, and you get much better validities. So the name of the game is to find the most relevant scales and add them up. And that's in a way what Stewart was demonstrating towards the end of his talk. From the kind of research, some expert systems were developed. And so that is, for example, concerned with creativity and innovation. It says there that I'm not likely to hold back when asked for inputs. That was 20 years ago. I've matured a bit, so I don't argue as much anymore with people. And I learned to listen. You grow up, you realize that your parents are not perfect and are just doing what they can. And you realize that bosses are not perfect and do what they can in the constraints of their environment. And so that's an example of how the information can be used. We put the personality scales together to drive a narrative. And another element that happened there is that we took the research and moved from 13 criterion areas in the meta-analysis to 16 competencies in the inventory of management competencies. And I used that as a criterion measure for some ability tests that we developed, the advanced managerial tests. So for the first time, we had a standardized criterion measure. And that, in a way, laid the foundation for finding the grade 8. So there were a number of studies going on, the international validation study, as we called it, and then we designed some equations. And our recommendation would be really to use expert judgment to some extent, ask people what they think, what scales should correlate with particular areas. We can do it also in a logical concordance, very scientific way. I've done that with one of my German MSc students. We can also look at job analysis, and we need to put all that information together. We also need to think about what happens if I use a normative measure, what happens if I do an ipsative measure where there is interdependence. And for example, in the case of Spark, it's quite clear that you would rather separate out the underlying everyday kind of qualities or personas and treat them as the main predictors, and overextended, you rather not use in the same way because they would dilute validity. And what we decided to do is basically give unit weights of, or integer weights, I should say, of 1, 2, 3, 4, depending on correlation size of 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. Very simple system. And what comes out is that we kind of can have Sten scores to predict what someone is going to be an expert and analytical and strategic. And it says here that I'm not so decisive, but I used to procrastinate, but I'm not sure now. It's a bad idea to try to put importance, the work requirements, onto the same scale as the person prediction score. You can see it's quite difficult to grasp. What most providers are now currently doing is do a 5-point prediction, and then the scales that go in, they are basically evaluated whether a particular score supports a prediction, a positive prediction or not. And in the IVS, we had 5 UK studies, a Turkish study and a US study. And when my colleagues were doing their proposed equations, they did what people would nowadays call people analytics, artificial intelligence. So they basically ran multiple regression. And I got extremely annoyed when they were proposing a different equation depending on whether ability tests were part of the regression or not. Because I don't think that makes any sense that your personality changes depending on whether you have an ability test or not. So I hijacked the data and made some equations that tend to work reasonably well. You can see that, say, written communication is mainly predicted by ability tests, not so much by personality. Makes sense. Problem solving, specialist knowledge is about equally predicted from personality and ability variables, and everything else is only predicted by personality variables. So what I have increasingly come to wonder about is whether Hunter and Schmidt are correct with their claim that ability tests are the single best predictor of performance. And when I looked into it, I was quite disappointed, if not shocked, that it's really a result of very extreme corrections for restriction of range. If you compare accountants to the general population, then you get a really big difference in ability levels. And because of those artifact corrections, that's why ability tests get such a high validity in academia. But when we do our studies, we never find such validities. We are very happy when we find a 0.2 observed validity. So I had a bit of a battle with the Norwegian Test Review Institute on that, and I'm pleased to report that I won. Okay, then this kind of research, did you see that? That was a 90s effect there. That led me kind of the meta-analysis, developing a set of 12 ability tests, developing these equations, and driving the AIMS project, career AIMS. AIMS stands for ability, interest, motivation, and style, the kind of trait attributes that you would probably want to measure in a career setting. That led me to, you saw it? So that led me to put together the WOW model. So we've got the trait dispositions at the center. Next layer is the attainments, so it's quite different types of information. So they are based on experience and learning. And they kind of are the attributes that people bring to the workplace. And at the workplace, you can look at the tasks that have to be performed, the context, the culture of the organization, the circumstances, and they require they determine the demands of the role. And the demands of the role are actually moderated by the people around you. What does your boss think you ought to be doing? What do your peers, what do they expect you to do? What do your subordinates want? They want you to give you a day off and be nice to you rather than perhaps get a job done. And so we need to look at performance as being at the interface of person and environment interaction. Okay, I then managed to put that into a book chapter, the book chapter that almost never was. I was meant to talk about performance management, all right, and I did my first cut. The professor who was meant to write with me was not interested, so I had to do it on my own while over in Japan on secondment. And the editor said, "This is no good, scrap it." And I said, "This is about performance. So if you don't know what performance is about, how can you manage performance?" And then Dave Bartram came to the rescue and restructured everything, and suddenly it was okay. And the big professor was the co-author. And what we say here is pretty much the same thing. People and environment interact to produce performance. It's my most popular download on ResearchGate. More than 1,000 people have downloaded it, and it's going places in academia, so I'm quite pleased with that. Then this chart we used at SHL to show how organizational strategy and demand drives requirements. People bring potential, competency potential, and in the workplace we can then observe performance, which then leads to outcomes. And we can't easily measure outcomes because managerial jobs are complex. It's not like widget making. You can't just count how many widgets managers make. So that's why 360 ratings are probably the best bet for understanding performance. And so we got instrumentation. Most publishers have instrumentation of that kind, trait predictors, something to measure the requirements, 360 tools, and then more idiosyncratic key performance indicators. And then basically the grade 8 emerged out of this kind of line of research. The big 5 accounted for most of the validation. data, but we needed to represent general mental ability somehow. And then also need for achievement was needed to account for personal motivation, commercial awareness, ambition, need for power, need for control, help to explain leadership and decision making. And there we go, the big 8. And then Dave Bartram said, oh, the great 8. So that's how we came to this. And we put that in the book chapter, 2002. And then I made a new variation of it in 2003 that was not really by choice. The research department was made redundant just when this was coming into the market. So not very nice to be made redundant at that point in time. So on a beach in Fiji, on my sponsored tour around the world, paid for by redundancy money, I kind of came up with an alternative set of labels, which is the middle one here, more applied and grouped into 4 clusters. And those who are familiar with WAVE will recognize a few of these cluster names, such as solving problems, influencing people. So that, in a way, WAVE was born on a beach in Fiji. And that's basically the model that Stewart used as his criterion measure. And he showed you earlier the structure. Those people who are very down-to-earth and evidence-based, they might want to make a note that I changed this line in this slide. So basically, I put my model in a self-addressed envelope and posted it to myself and to a few friends who are lawyers, just to timestamp that I've done this work in 2003 before, for example, the Savills called me to help them develop WAVE. Okay, a few more data slides here. Some of these 8 factors we can predict more easily, like supporting and cooperating, being nice. We can predict well. Adapting and coping is a less observable competency, so you get less prediction. And then you get the kind of cross-diagonal in the meta-analysis. Here, 0.17 was the average, and 0.29, I think, was the average that Stewart presented, so pretty good going. And then I moved to Saville Consulting, and there we got it all in the bag model, behavior, ability, and global aspects of competency. So competency profiling operates on that system with 36 dimensions, 6 abilities, and then global covers the other half of the model, the kind of specialist expertise and outcomes. And well, that's a simplified version of the world of work model. And the behavioral model we put into the WAVE wheel, where we've got kind of a task axis with divergent and convergent thinking, and the people axis with a more kind of dominant behaviors and a nice behavior. So it's a quasi-circumplex. And I think Stewart quite liked that. We used then the data to put prediction equations together, guided by data we put in unit weights, 1:7 ratio maximum, to get good prediction. And I recently had a symposium organized where Saville was contributing, and you can see here the kind of average values, 0.27. Again, the spark values compare very well to that. And these are basically the leading tools. And the off-diagonal is nicely low. And then what we found is like a 3-factor model actually accounts best for the WAVE data. And that led then to the next round of development at Cubics. But in between, I had the opportunity for some sparkling innovation. I did the Dr. K Innovation Awards, and Lumina was one of the winners for sparkling innovation. So that's my splash. And I found the tool very accurate, and especially like on reliable. It was the only tool that recognized really my characteristics, and at that time I was quite overextended into a few things, and the tool captured it quite accurately. And I did a bit of freelance work where we then mapped the qualities to particular client competencies, and I also had a bit of a hand in the Lumina emotion. And so I think it's a very nice way to use psychometric information. And we basically had that in various symposium presentations. We went up and down the country, Glasgow, Nottingham, Liverpool, and Stratford-upon-Avon, doing symposia. And that's always very joyful. At my company at Cubics, we use competencies across the whole range, but it's a relatively dated model from 2002, but the whole employee life cycle can be covered with competency tools. I've been to PsyOp quite a few times and explained there the background of the latest model at Cubics. And a lot of these things will sound familiar: general factor of personality, hierarchical structure, circumplex models, and then from this century, the grade 8 and learning agility model, a construct whose time has come and gone, I would say. So not really my favorite. And then I came up with this great term, emotional intelligence, learning agility. Emotional agility, that must be the buzzword of the future. And then I found out it was already trademarked by those people. So that's, you've got Lumina emotion rather than emotional agility. Okay, so my idea of fun is factor analysis. 3 factors, 6 factors, 8, pick your favorite number. And that was reanalysis of Kurz and Woods. We applied the grade 8 methodology to PAPI, but found that some of the areas we couldn't measure so well. So the co-author here was Nikita, the psychonaut, the naughty psychonaut, I should say. And all of this comes now together, like everyone talks about potential. So my colleague David Lawton put that together, an analysis of Silser and Church. We put that together in a 6-factor model. So if the big 5 are there, grade 8 over there, and PAPI has already 7 factors, then 6 was the only number left. So big 5 plus need for achievement, quite similar circumplex kind of characteristics to Spark. And does it work? Yeah, that works. Slightly lower than the Spark data on this particular version of the analysis. And finally, my penultimate slide is putting this all together. If you have listened to me, what kind of pattern can you see there? If these are the big 5 and the grade 8 in a heat map, red being the most central constructs, so most central are emotional stability and leading and deciding, what else can you see on that map? So agreeableness and conscientiousness.
Can I comment on it, Ryan? Because when I look at that map, if you look at extroversion and emotional stability, they're sort of close because they sort of correlate. You know? And the things that are far away, I see it as like a mountain. That's a big mountain in the middle, you know, in red. And you know, agreeableness in the top left is a long way away from openness in the bottom right, because they may even be negatively correlated. So it's looking at the structure of the big 5, but with the great 8 on there as well. I do find that quite an interesting and profound way of visualizing the data as if it's a terrain. Yeah.
And then what underpins it is essentially the alpha factor is at the top, the beta factor at the bottom, and they contrast. And the other contrast is people versus task. And in a way, the Spark tool captures this rather nicely, and that was in a way one of my last papers at Saville. And leading to the dark side, those who are familiar with the HDS tool will know the 11 scales. Being dutiful seems to be being overly agreeable, and that seems to have negative validity. Being overly diligent is like too much conscientiousness, but that's really not a bad thing. That actually correlates positively with success. Overly imaginative, eccentric, kind of wearing the wrong tie, that is bad news. I should learn that. And being bold, mischievous, colorful is actually extroversion in overdrive. That tends to produce performance. And finally, moving away, those 5 scales, it's like moving away from people, and that's bad news. And it's not really an overused skill at all. It's just career-limiting, lack of skill territory. And then my final slide here. Some of the symposia that we traveled to were in Oslo. Also, we went to Vancouver and Dublin. The last 2 stops, Michele also joined us. So it was a bit like the traveling Wilburys on tour. And the most recent one, we went to Switzerland, and Stewart kindly helped me out when I had organized a symposium. 2 presenters couldn't make it in the end because it was too costly to come to the event. And I briefly show you what the topic of the symposium was. And it's really not the standard fare, things that are actually quite difficult to tackle. And I stumbled across a case in May 2012 that I've been investigating. And it's worse than the Jimmy Savile case. And so I've been presenting on that, and Stewart kindly provided the filling of the sandwich. So I did the first and the last paper, and Stewart did his PhD talk in between. And I'm very grateful for Stewart's support on these kind of matters. And so I better take that off again so that no one gets shocked when they see the PDF of the slide deck. So need a lot of kind of courage, compassion, and wisdom to tackle the things that we are tackling, deeply entrenched views in personality psychology or even in clinical psychology and psychiatry. And so my Buddhist virtues help me a lot. And I find that here with the Lumina family, you get a lot of those virtues. A lot of people have a lot of warmth and energy and enthusiasm. And it's time to take on the old guard in the old ways of thinking. And so thank you very much, Stewart, for inviting me to come. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rainer.
Thank you, Rainer. So I would like to moderate a little bit of Q&A. And actually, Seb, I know you're showing me 5. Let's make it 10. Can you give me 10? Thank you. So who would like to ask the first question? There was a lot of information there. We have a hand. Can we have a mic, please?
I really enjoyed your presentations, and what was going through my mind during the whole time is I was kind of thinking, where's the humanistic psychotherapeutic bit in it? So where's Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Where's inner-directed, outer-directed, sustenance-driven? Where's, family therapy? Where is all of that in any of this? And is there any intention to, have a different dimension to this? Because this feels like social styles, and I'm wondering whether there's something about values that is somehow missing.
It's a good question because...
Can you just summarize this question? Because maybe not all of us could understand the context of it.
Okay, so I'll give you my interpretation of the question, or the one I'm going to answer, which might not have been the one. What I heard Steve say is, like, where's humanistic psychology in this? Where's values in this? Where's inner-directed, outer-directed? And the subtext is that this is quite... Some of the research that both Rainer and myself presented here is a bit more left brain, traditional in some ways, or something like that. Can I answer that question?
Yes.
Phew, go for that. Yeah, so it was about 20 years ago that I started studying humanistic psychology and was very passionate about that. I went through a phase of not really being into want to quantify everything, because you don't really need to if you're doing that. And then went back through an integration and wanted to work psychometrically and link the two worlds of humanistic psychology, which you could say values, inner-directed, outer-directed. Let's put that here. I wanted to integrate that with an ability to quantify, but in a helpful way, a meaningful way, hence the need to remove bias and so on. However, to be really blunt, when it came to the PhD, it was more than enough to take on measuring personality, measuring way of being at both ends, adaptively, overextended, and proving that that is a useful thing to do. That was more than enough to do from a quantitative perspective without bringing everything else in. So to be blunt, I think if I'd tried to do everything I'd really wanted to do, it would have been more than one PhD and not worked. So, but to answer your question, what we're doing with Lumina, with Spark and all the resources, is of course the whole big thing. Yeah, so this was necessarily a bit more quantitative. Yep.
And may I add to that the Schwarz 1992 model of values, which is the leading model, is in a way well captured by Wave, Lumina Spark, and the Cubics model. It's this kind of task versus people differentiation, and then there's a convergent versus divergent thinking. Slightly different words are used in the Schwarz model, but we would expect quite high correlations, so there are values associated with these typical behavioral preferences. And it's a worthwhile area to look deeper into. People ask for culture fit and value fit, and it's a bit of a minefield when you have themes such as integrity, respect, and how do you want to measure them. But the Schwarz model, I think, is pretty good and can be operationalized.
Next question. Question from Lucy.
Hi there, fantastic presentation, both of them, although I'm high yellow, so I was struggling there a little bit. But one thing, just you threw it up at the end, and I'm very interested. I work for a high-tech company, which we get a lot of people from ex-defence come to work for us. And there's an increasing awareness of PTSD and or the autistic spectrum. So it's just generally two questions. Advice on using Lumina. You don't know these things are there whenever you're using Lumina, but things start to come out. And have you got anything you can refer us to just find out more? I thought that was very interesting what you put up and then quickly took away. So I'd like to hear more about that, please.
Yes, so I think in the commercial space, there's a lot of healthy competition. People develop tools that are better and better and better. And between the leading tools, you can't go too wrong. But in the clinical field, people are stuck on the MMPI from the 1940s, 1950s, or even worse, the Millen questionnaire. So quite poor psychometric characteristics that lead to re-victimization. And a lot of the national health services are geared up towards re-victimization rather than helping people. So against that background, it's quite a tough gig to deal with people who come into the workplace with trauma. There have been a few good presentations recently about therapy with people with PTSD who experience trauma in the police and so on. And to some extent, we have to leave it to the professionals and bring the professionals in. More and more clinical psychologists start to work also at the workplace. So I'm the Science and Practice Strategy Group convener, and we have a health section within occupational psychology. And they, for example, they gave a presentation about preventing suicide at a bank, a building society, when they were doing house repossessions. So we are asked to step up to the plate, and we have to do it properly and get suitably qualified people in. So on a personal level, I think it's tools like Lumina Spark that help with a very differentiated picture of underlying everyday and overextended results, where I believe that the overextended result is very much a person-environment interaction product and can highlight areas of conflict, but also possibly other deeper issues. And so I would look out for those differences where overextended scores are higher than the underlying and everyday.
So if I pick up on what Rainer's saying, my sort of practical take on that is you do look at the scores around overextended, but you have a dialogue as well. And I have a heightened awareness that when you have a dialogue and take people through spark and emotion, you need to be aware it is possible they could be suffering from something that could be more serious. And as Rainer says, to know how to bring in support and to direct them in the right direction when that's needed. And I have actually experienced that a number of times over the last decade. I have quite a heightened awareness. I think that's for all of us to be acutely aware that we could, through having a rich and meaningful dialogue with somebody, uncover things that need support beyond the support we can normally provide. Yeah. Thanks. Question here?
Wait for the mic, please.
Thanks. I'm going to speak to that, if I may, too, because as Stewart knows, I've combined mindfulness with Lumina Spark in pain sufferers who have a lot of trauma in their background, and we found them very receptive of Lumina Spark and tracking it back to when their health gave way in conflict situations and so on. We had a lot of PTSD victims. In fact, 90% of our patients would score for post-traumatic stress disorder, whether it's a small t or a large t trauma. And the languaging is so important. So in our mindfulness courses, we've developed languaging that works not to trigger, but to invite. And we've also developed ways of allowing them to sort of dip their toe in the water, as it were, as things arise. But we've definitely taken some of our people through Lumina Spark who've had trauma and have applied the same, the languaging is beautiful in Lumina Spark. It's very inviting, it's very non-threatening. And now there's this term in many corporations, trauma-informed, trauma sensitivity, trauma-informed. There's a book out now called Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness. And now the whole mindfulness world is kind of on its end because we realize we've got trauma everywhere. And we need to be very conscious of not triggering in an environment that's not supportive. But the facilitators in Lumina are so supportive.
I don't want to cut you off, but I do just want to fit one more question, and we're almost out of time.
So the question I have is, could we now create Lumina to be trauma-sensitive or trauma-informed?
I think it's not that. I think the tool itself, for example, is very powerful, and when I used it, I found it very helpful and insightful, and the language is conducive to the discussions. I think it's great to have a family of practitioners, and some of them will combine their own expertise and use and go further with the tool than others. But it would be quite dangerous to productize such an approach, because then it would invite dabblers in who then jump on a bandwagon. And so I think individual practitioners, I think, can extend usage, but it probably should not be productized and commercialized, as there will be drawbacks and possibly a backlash. So Nikita organized a psychology in the pub session where that was kind of discussed, where some employers ask for people to take people to basically through kind of counseling, 8 appointments per day. People with psychology degrees shouldn't apply because they want to just have a quick throughput. And so I think my take would be to be cautious about it.